Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Turner, and today I'll be talking to you about marijuana prohibition. In 2012, the FBI released a report saying, on average, there are 750,000 people going to jail every year on marijuana-based charges. That relates to one arrest being made every 42 seconds and costing the U.S. $8.7 billion annually. The war on drugs now reaching its fourth decade. One question must be asked: is it working? In brief, no. There are still people doing drugs, and there are still people going to jail, with no end to the cycle in sight. I believe it's a fair statement to say that marijuana use causes less harm to the community than the marijuana prohibition itself. When I'm talking about use, I'm talking about responsible and reasonable amounts. I'm not talking about an ounce a day, or driving while stoned, or operating machinery. I'm talking about a person in the confines of his own home using marijuana responsibly. In this argument, I will explain how marijuana does not harm the community in the commonly believed ways, such as a gateway drug or a cognitive suppressant. And I'll also show how prohibition is increasing crime and making the community more dangerous. Marijuana has a reputation of being a gateway drug, and by a gateway drug, it's a drug that encourages the use of harder narcotics or stimulants, any substance such as heroin or cocaine or meth. But not only is this incorrect, it's also not sound from a logical standpoint. It operates under the slippery slope fallacy, which states if A happens, then B will happen, then C will happen, then D will happen. If you don't desire D, then you shouldn't let A happen. But you can't make that argument just based on that. You have to prove each step that there is no other option, which we don't see because not every marijuana user does heroin or cocaine. And a study by the RAND group found that people who take marijuana are more likely not to do cocaine or heroin. Instead, they discovered that people are more influenced to do harder drugs by their environment. It's similar to how there are more liquor stores in lower income areas. It's not that liquor stores make people poor, it's that liquor stores do better in poor areas, which is why people who do marijuana also do harder drugs, in the sense that it's not because of marijuana, it's because they like doing drugs. And marijuana is also believed to damage memory and other cognitive functions, yet a study by A.J. Gordon found no long-term effects in adults with even usage as common as twice a week. And we see no damage to central nervous systems, which include the spine, brainstem, and brain, and this would be where addiction would come in. With addiction to hard drugs, we do see the brain chemistry changing, that the brain is no longer able to operate on a functional basis. And we have, reports that say marijuana is addictive, but the characteristics for marijuana addiction are different than the characteristics for heroin addiction. They're not being treated by the same metric. Marijuana addiction is classified as strong cravings or apathy, boredom, whereas heroin addictions range from heart palpitations, tremors, migraines, nausea, diarrhea, unable to breathe, all sorts of severe medical situations. And my third point, prohibition doesn't protect the community from drug use. It actually increases crime rate and doesn't prevent people from improving their lives once they've had an encounter. So with prohibition, there isn't a state regulatory system that prevents children from getting a hold of it. It's just as easy for someone who is 21 to get marijuana than it is for someone who is 14 to get it. Because there's no one across the counter checking IDs, and because the person who is selling the marijuana isn't subject to any laws, it's easier for children to get it than it is to get alcohol. And then this also fuels organized crime and untaxed income. Marijuana is a $35.8 billion a year industry, and none of that is getting taxed or regulated. And all that is going towards gangs, cartels across the border, to places where it's causing more harm back to us. And it's also harder for people who have been convicted of marijuana crimes to further their employment. you can not get hired because of a misdemeanor that's in your record as far back as 15 years. So it's harder for these people who have been exposed to this to better themselves and get out of harmful behaviors. It's just this prohibition creates this system that kind of caves in on itself. It stops people from getting out of it, but doesn't prevent people from coming in. So that is why I feel marijuana prohibition is bad to the community. Thank you.
All right, Andrew, you set up the topic pretty clearly. You've got a good piece of statistical information that you start off with, although I do think you want to make sure that it's the 750,000 people are going to jail and not just arrested, because those are not necessarily the same thing. Since you've got that statistic, I was wondering why there wasn't a little bit more follow-up on it later on in your argument. The closest you come to it is the argument on the third point that suggests that sometimes people might have employment issues because of a conviction down the road. And I think that there are probably a lot of other arguments to be made about spending our resources, time, or having this as a potential drawback on society by arresting those people. Even if they aren't imprisoned, there could be some reason why that is in fact a danger. So having mentioned it at the beginning, it seems strange that it didn't really come up as a major issue in the supporting structure. You do a pretty good job setting up what the supporting claims are going to be. That's fine. I do have this question that pops up with, you kind of have this negative definition at the beginning, what you don't mean by the kinds of things that you're talking about, and you say, people who are smoking an ounce a day or, going through all this stuff. We're talking about people who smoke reasonably in their homes and are not driving, blah, 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 blah. My guess would be, and I'm not positive about this, that the people who are smoking in their homes and are not driving are not the ones who are getting arrested. So I think you set up a little bit of a dilemma for yourself there at the beginning. The gateway drug issue is signposted at the beginning. That's pretty clear. You give kind of a definition about what's going on there. I think that the information that you have here is more explanation than it is proof. There was a little bit of a reference to a statistic, but it was not a very clear statistic, and I think that that's problematic. The next thing I knew it, you were on the second point. I didn't really hear a signpost or a transition to that second point, and I think that's a little problematic. You do have some data on that point, but it goes by quickly, and then we're talking about addiction and what the difference between the different types of addiction. I think there needs to be an explanation about why that difference matters. Having described the fact that the addictions are different, tell us why the kind of addiction or the kind of compulsion, maybe it's a better term than addiction, that marijuana users have is either less destructive, less problematic, something that doesn't affect us in the same way that heroin addiction does. I'm sure there's a reason why that's important. The third point, you did have a clearer sight on. It came in, and there was a nice transition point on that, so that was fine. Supporting information, a little bit inconsistent. At the beginning, you had some statistical information. There's a couple of places where there are references to quotes, but sometimes it sounds like I'm getting a paraphrase of a quote rather than the quote themselves. We've got a lot of hypothetical examples that are being used to support those positions, and I think that becomes kind of a crutch for you to rely on all those sorts of things, and I think that there is data on these points that you could develop pretty easily. You did a very nice job presenting the argument. You speak speak clearly. It's easy to follow. You have an interesting way of delivering the message. I do think that you actually have an exit claim that's a little bit simpler and to the point than you had for the proposition, too. All right. Thank you.